Hello everyone, Donne here, and today we are going to be talking about book sales. What is kind of normal? What can you expect? Brought to you by TikTok. Yeah, so you can tell I'm on deadline, you can tell I'm procrastinating because I finally threw myself headlong into TikTok. After a year of saying I would and then not, I've lost my mind. It's great. So I made a TikTok about this topic, which was kind of inspired by a different TikTok that I saw and responded to. And I was like, how have I not made a video on this? I mean, I kind of know. So book sales are pretty opaque. We tend not to talk about this stuff. And even as an author, when you're entrenched in the system, I've heard from multiple people who have asked me or have asked their friend and their friend has asked me, and I've asked other people, what is considered normal, especially for your first week, your second, your third, 6 months out, a year out? At what point should you be worried about your book sales? What's considered good versus bad, failure versus success? It's super opaque. Part of that is, I mean, publishing suffers from the same issue as many areas in industry and, aspects of culture. We're weird about talking about money too, and sales essentially are money, which is part of it. If you know someone's sales, you can often get a good idea of how much money they're making. It gets really dicey. But also sales numbers are just really kind of personal. We attach a lot of our self-worth to our sales. There's a lot of shame attached to sales, but I think a lot of that shame comes from, well, you assume you're failing, but until someone talks to you and tells you otherwise, you don't know, relatively speaking, kind of what's good versus what's bad. But I want to talk about it a little bit more in depth in a video, because what else is YouTube for? But if you want me in short form and slightly more often than you're getting on YouTube at this time, because I can technically, theoretically TikTok and be on deadline at the same time, theoretically I am procrastinating, go follow me on TikTok. But first, what brought me to this topic and how am I going to cover it? I saw a TikTok, the person they meant well, but the stat that was posted was something extreme, 98% of traditionally published authors sell fewer than 5,000 copies. And it kind of went into this whole thing. It was actually about how this is great because we have TikTok and Patreon and all these other platforms to promote ourselves, which is a whole other topic. I have feelings about the marketing expectations placed on authors, she says, being on TikTok and YouTube. But I I Googled it. It was a very specific stat from the year 2020, published in 2021, only about new books released in 2020, which is actually a year where sales were up for books, period, but the majority of those sales went to already established books, already established bestsellers. We knew this. But it got me thinking, well, who's gonna know what's normal and what to expect in traditional publishing if we rarely, if ever, actually talk about sales? I'm going to be speaking primarily from the perspective of someone who sits more in the mid-list. I'm also, of course, a YA author, though not everything I'm going to be talking about is YA specific, though it does apply to YA. The numbers are going to be pretty comfortable for kind of average, mid-list, etc., adult in select genres as well. And that's generally the thing, everything is contextual and everything is nuanced, but still, going off of a sample of my own sales, the sales of many friends of mine who write in a lot of genres and categories, I'll hopefully be able to provide some reassurance, ballpark numbers, but I also hesitate to provide ballpark numbers because meaning it's so hard to say if you sell less than X number of copies, you're in trouble. But at the same time, it's just true in the industry that when you hear that XYZ book only sold X number of copies, there is often that hissing through teeth moment, people who know, we look at each other and it's so hard, but I don't want to make anyone feel bad. This is why it is so hard to talk about numbers, but regardless, I'll provide some of kind of the sanity check stuff that I put in that TikTok, just with a lot more details. So first up, the thing that kind of kicked me off on TikTok with that stat about the 5,000 copies thing, I have sold more than 5,000 copies of each of my books, And in fact, one of those books came out in 2020, so it was one of those newly released titles. And that just honestly makes me question, like, where did that stat come from? Like, we know that 2020 was a big year for already established bestsellers, but I know multiple people who had newly released titles in 2020 who all sold more than 5,000 copies. So I have question marks there. And generally speaking, it is true. If you sell more than 5,000 copies of your title, let's say over the course of a year or so, you're in a pretty good place. Asterisk, so long as you weren't paid astronomical amounts of money for your book advance. And that's why this is nuanced and contextual, because everything is, you know, relative to what your publisher expects of your book. And I'll also say, when in doubt, ask your agent, ask your publisher. Ask them the numbers that they were hoping for. Ask them for their perspective on the numbers that you're getting for your sales. Ask them about your sales if you don't have something like an author portal available to you. You can look things up on BookScan, and many of us do, but always bear in mind that BookScan is not completely accurate. There's always going to be, I tend to multiply the number by 2 to 3 times, because that's pretty realistic in my experience of my BookScan numbers versus what I know my numbers to actually be. So there's always a range. When I see a number on BookScan, I'll say, okay, so they probably sold between 2 and 3 times what that number on BookScan says. And I don't share my own numbers as a flex. It's a micro flex, but I'm honestly proud of the fact that in many ways I have defied statistics, because it is an accomplishment to sell more than 5,000 copies of your book, specifically hard copies. Publishing is really looking at your hardcovers, your paperback if you have paperback. Yes, ebooks and audiobooks of course count, but in terms of like ROI and where the publishers are concentrating most of their money, we're really looking at hardcover book sales, or paperback if that is your kind of first release. And it is an accomplishment to sell more than 5,000 copies. And I just want to I don't like the fear mongering of, ooh, most people in trad pub can't even sell 5,000 copies. Because in my experience, that's just not true. The sad fact is the new Midwest that we live in is that sweet spot of selling 5 to 10 to 15,000 copies. And it used to be that, yeah, if you only sold 5,000 copies, you really weren't in a particularly good place. But book sales are down across the board, at least certainly in YA. So you're in a really good spot if you sell 5,000 copies. But what about kind of your first week, when you first come out? What should you expect? So generally speaking, the one thing I want to caution people against is do not panic if you don't break 1,000 copies your first week out. It's not that common to break 1,000 copies your first week out. Of course, there are books that do it. They tend to get more push from their publishers, or, you know, they're already established authors. I will tell you personally, it took me 3 books to break 1,000 copies in my first week. And when I did for the Ivies, that was you should always have your own personal benchmarks and goals as an author that you want to reach. And me working my way up to that was it was a huge accomplishment for me. So bearing that in mind, totally normal not to break 1,000 copies in your first week. Where do you go from there? Where do you get granular to what's good versus what's bad from there? Again, it's going to depend on your category, your genre, and how much they paid you in your advance. And then what it means for your sales trend / tail, which I am going to talk more about. But generally speaking, frankly, especially as a debut, if you can sell 500 copies, if you can break 500 copies your first week, you're doing really, really well. That is hard to do. Honestly, even if you break 300 copies, 200, 250, 300, that's nothing to sneeze at. That is pretty good, especially when we're going to talk about a sales tail. It is true if you hear about someone selling fewer than 200 copies, or fewer than 300 or 400, depending on the circumstances. If you know someone got a high advance, or if you know it's in a sexy genre, or if you know their publisher pushed the book really hard, yeah, those are hissing through your teeth numbers. But again, it depends, because at a smaller publisher, for example, those might be actually really big numbers, especially for a debut. It all depends. So what is actually really important, your first week is important. because there are two kinds of sales trends that you're going to see as an author. The vast majority of us experience type number one, I have, where your first week is most often the most books you will ever sell in a single week. First weeks are generally pretty important. In this scenario, you're going to see a drop off in week 2 to week 3 to week 4. Often it's more than 50%. Sometimes it's even more than that. That's largely because, you know, a lot of like your stickiest readers probably got it the first week, they pre-ordered it, and you have just a natural drop off. 50% is great. If you can have only a 50% drop off, you're in a pretty good position. So if in week 1 you sell 1,200 copies, if you sell 600 copies in week 2 or more than 600 copies, you're in a really good place. But honestly, even if it's more than 50%, I've seen drop-offs of 75% or more, and that's totally normal, asterisk within reason. So if you go from 1,200 copies and then 400 copies, that's still pretty good, honestly, because selling 400 copies in a week is still a really good week. Let's say you start out at 600 copies. Your first week you sell 600. The second week, 300. Still a really good number. Even if you sell 150 or 200 your second week, still a decent number, provided you sustain. What you basically want to see happen, ideally, is you have your first week, it's your big week. Then you have your drop off, 50, 75, 80%, whatever. The ideal thing is then that you sustain whatever that second week number is, that you sustain in that ballpark for as long as possible. This is because, generally speaking, publishing is a long game. Yes, it is great to come out strong out the gate, to debut really, really strong, but if you don't have a decently strong sales tail, it honestly, in the long run, won't matter if you break out really, really big in that first week, which brings me to that little tidbit of tea about some bestsellers. Some. I definitely know cases where a book was a bestseller for a week, maybe 2. But if you go back and look at total sales like 6 months to a year later, some mid-list titles outsell those books. It's great to start off big, but what really matters is it's a marathon, not a sprint. Slow and steady can win the race, so to speak. I mean, you're still a mid-lister and you don't get to call yourself a bestseller, but you know inside. So you want to maintain that second sales week as long as possible. So if you sell 600 your first week and your fall off is to 400, but if you sell 400 for 2 to 3 weeks, then you have like another drop, like maybe to 200, and you do that for a few weeks. If for the first 2 to 3 months you're selling between 200 and 400 copies a week, that really adds up. And then it's natural to have another drop. The most common drop I see that I've had on all of my books is like you're gonna sit in the sweet spot of approximately 100 copies sold a week. Like when that happens does vary, but if you're 6 months out and you're still selling anywhere near 100 copies a week, honestly, if you're 6 months out and you are selling 50 to 100 copies a week, between 40, 50 up to 100 copies a week, you are in a really good position. That is a good sales tail simply because it slowly but surely adds up. You're obviously not going to be a bestseller with that kind of sales tail, but you're still selling a decent number of books. And then it is super, super normal, with all of that said, the 6 to 8 month mark, or slightly earlier than 6 months sometimes, but going out to the year, selling 20 to 30 copies a week, totally fine, totally normal. And then you just want to sustain that as long as humanly possible. Once you fall below 20 to 30 copies a week, you definitely end up in a position where, I mean, it happens to all books, but you just want to go a little higher as long as humanly possible. That said, context, nuance, all of that. Don't panic if these aren't your numbers and this isn't your trajectory, because as I said, everything is context. That has been my experience as a pretty solid mid-lister and talking to lots and lots of people who have pretty good sales, nothing astronomical, but they've had similar kind of sales and drop off and kind of plateau patterns. And you can definitely It adds up. You can sell more than 5,000 copies. You can sell more than 8,000 copies, 10,000 copies if you just slowly but steadily chip away at your sales numbers. And as long as you weren't paid an astronomical advance and your publisher wasn't expecting you to be a breakout bestseller, you shouldn't really have major problems selling your next book. And as I said, you could be at a much smaller publisher where 50 copies a week, even early on in the trajectory, 20, 30 a week, is still really, really good and puts you in a really, really good position. And you do add other formats to this. I'm primarily talking about physical copies with TradPub, but ebook and audio do matter and do count, and they add to your overall number. So with those numbers factored in, you could see yourself, selling more 10, 15, 20,000 copies of your book over the course of a couple of years. And that's pretty good. Now it's the other scenario you asked. That was like the typical one. Most people, the most copies they're gonna sell is their first week out, unless something crazy happens, like you're chosen for a book club or you get a TV adaptation or something else like that. And I will tell you, as an author, what has happened to me recently for the Ivies, first time this has happened, and it is it is great. I've seen a sales spike, like going from like 30 copies a week to over 100 copies because some stuff has been going on with the Ivies lately, and it's a delightful thing. So sales tails and trends can go in all sorts of interesting places, and some genres have longer tails than others. And being frank, when I got into thrillers, I knew that it was a long tail genre. Like, don't panic if you're publishing a genre that tends to thrive off of word of mouth, that has lots of opportunity for a book to see success over a long period of time. You don't have to stress as much about like not selling 8 million copies in your first week. And then the other trend, far more straightforward, is books that grow. Their first week is not their biggest week of sales. They take off, they win an award, something big happens, they list, and they only sell more copies progressively every single week. In some cases, it's gonna plateau eventually, but like bestsellers, that's what happens to them. Like when Go Girl's Guide to Murder came out, and my friends who had BookScan were like looking it up, and we were like, wow, like the sales trend on that book was really impressive. Like the first week was good, but then the second week it got bigger, and the third week, I think it listed in the second week or the third week, and then it exploded, and like you watch the trend. And those books plateau eventually, but the plateau is selling more books in a single week than most of us could ever hope to sell. Pretty cool. And then of course that also means, they're gonna be books that their first week isn't their biggest week. They're gonna peak at a certain point and then fall off. But still, that kind of trajectory is definitely the dream, to have a book that only grows after its first week. So something that this all kind of comes back to is advances, earning out. And it's just the friendly reminder that most books don't earn out. It's totally normal not to earn out. And your publisher is going to make money off of your book long before you ever do, if you do earn out, or if you don't. They are making money off of you. I mean, that's one thing we like about the advance system. They can't take it back from us, but like, you are not a failure if you don't earn out your advance. That said, that's why there is kind of like this like unspoken number where like we know, if we hear it, like publishing professionals, that it's not great, because statistically it's unlikely that the publisher has made any return on investment if a book sells only X copies. And I really hesitate to kind of share those concrete numbers because I don't want to freak anyone out. So I'll just say, like, if you are worried about your sales numbers, talk to your agent first and foremost. Like, that's what they're there for. They're there to give you context and kind of reassure you or give you tough love, whatever you prefer to hear from them. But also, one book is only one book. Just do your best to kind of push through. If you have a book that doesn't meet sales expectations, your personal expectations, or your publisher's expectations, just, do the best that you can. My honest advice here, and I have a whole video on what to do when your book fails, depending on your situation, I do think that tends to mean you gotta go really, really hard on whatever your next book idea is. It is 100% possible to have disappointing sales numbers on one book and then crush it on your next book. I have seen it happen, and ideally the thing that you want to have happen in your career, I mean, we can't all be breakout bestsellers. If you are a breakout bestseller, that's amazing, but there are only two career trajectories. You either are a breakout bestseller on your first book, and it's the biggest book you ever publish, and it sets you up, not always for a whole career by the way, but it sets you up for a decent number of time. Publishers will probably buy your next couple of books, or you slow and steadily win the race. Those are the two trajectories, and your first book is not your biggest book, and you're gonna build with each book. I am a build with each book author. I am here to like reassure you, like you are never one book. There's always another book. There are always other avenues and options for you, because the industry can be really, really tough. But if you're stressing about your sales, don't stress out too much about your sales. If you're wondering about trad pub sales and you hear the fear mongers tell you they can't even sell 5,000 copies of their book, yes, we can. Yes, we do. And I am not a lead title. I'm a mid-lister, and I have sold like I'm very happy with my book sales. I have sold a good number of books. I don't say that to be divisive, but just to kind of, you know, quell a misconception that I definitely have heard. Generally speaking, anytime you can get several thousand people to buy a copy of your book, no matter what your path is, you should really pat yourself on the back, because it's really, really hard. Like 3 to 2, 3, 4, 5,000 plus people who aren't even your friends and family, you're doing pretty good. While we're on the subject of career trajectory, I will leave you with a final juicy tidbit. This is something you have to be in the industry a little bit longer to see this, but I have now seen this happen more than once, and it was definitely really affirming for me, and I think it can be affirming for other people as well, just to remember that you truly are not one book. You are not your first book, especially. Something that I have seen happen more than once in YA is a book is really, really buzzy as a debut. It has like a really good kind of upward trajectory, good first week. Some of them are bestsellers, some of them aren't, but generally like they do numbers. Everyone's talking about those books. They're all over BookTube and Bookstagram and now BookTok. And yeah, you're like, wow, this person's solid. They're doing so much better than I am. But you need to look at a career not just over one book. You need to look at book 2, book 3. And just like you can have fall off, you do have fall off between week 1 and week 2 of book sales, or like the first few weeks and then the subsequent weeks and months. This happens book to book as well. And something that's especially brutal, I've seen it with series a lot, but also with standalones, is when someone is that big buzzy debut and they do numbers. And it especially breaks my heart when I see them quit their jobs, but then book 2, and often also book 3, the fall off is massive. The book to book fall off. I'm talking like an author who maybe sold 15,000, 20,000 copies of their first book, but their second one, they're struggling to sell 5,000 copies. Yes, it's still always good to sell 5,000 copies, but not when your benchmark is 20,000 copies. I've seen some extreme cases of people where I was really shocked to see the first 2-3 months their books were out, they weren't even breaking 1,000 copies sold on BookScan. Now we know realistically that means the real number is a little bit higher than that, but not breaking 1,000 copies on BookScan when you've been out for a few months, when you know that someone was paid a lot of money, when previously they had a really high profile, it happens more often than you think. And I think it just really emphasizes how you are not just one book. It's a longer game. Building a career can be really, really challenging. I also personally think it says a lot. Like, I have a lot of reasons I'm not in love with author as brand. I think you need to build readership of the books before you build fans of the author, for this reason, because people can really, really love an author and they might buy one book, but that doesn't mean they're going to buy subsequent ones if you haven't actually turned them into a reader and not just a fan of the author. So truly, be the tortoise, not the hare in this situation. Unless you can be the hare and like keep going fast forever. In that case, we love a breakout. But just kind of know that slow and steady can win the race. You still gotta like bring your A game, but it's a much longer game than just 1 week, 1 book. And ultimately what you want is to steadily build, have consistency, because book sales add up over time, and you can build a readership for yourself and build a career. So yeah, YouTube, that's my long form on this topic. Can't believe I'm doing TikToks now. You can just tell I'm trying not to write my books, so I would love to hear down below. I feel like this one will prompt a lot of questions. It's a weird topic, it's a sensitive topic, it's thorny, it's personal. And as I said, go follow me on TikTok if you want to hear from me slightly more often, at least at this juncture, in much shorter form. Me trying to like limit myself to a minute or 3 minutes has been a time. Very, very fun. I'm also posting like some funny, like more personal stuff over there that just don't make sense to do on YouTube or on Instagram. So yeah, I'm kind of having a good time, but my editor sees this. Yes, I know I need to be writing my book. I'm fine. We're fine. Give this video a thumbs up if you like it. If you're not already subscribed, go ahead and do that. And as always, guys, thank you so much for watching and happy writing.